a whole bunch of people now on the line from across the country. And to note, as you just heard, this conference is being recorded, just so everyone knows that up front. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Colin Smith. I'm on the results staff here in DC, where I help steer some of our communications and media work. And we are here tonight to discuss the outcome of a project that was launched. Tom can maybe give us a little more the full history, but well over a year ago now, in a partnership of a few different organizations, all of whom work on global equity and global poverty issues, results included. The sort of goal of this work was figuring out how, as we all do our work, to ensure that the geography and circumstances of a person's birth doesn't impact the opportunity that they have and the fate they face in life. We wanted to see if a shift in our language could help build support for the issues that we care about at Results and as a community of people committed to a world where health, education, and economic opportunity are available to everyone. And so we set about to find ways to change the conversation to make sure that we were convincing as many people as we could that support for global development was a good thing for us to be doing and a good way for us to spend our time and to spend our resources. And so excited to be able to discuss some of the outcomes of some of the research that happened, as well as a lot of conversations that have been going on in the United States and around the world over the last months and really over a year. And we are particularly lucky because we have one of the masterminds of all of this from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Tom Black, joining us this evening. And I will turn things over to Tom in just a second. But I wanted to say a word first of welcome to everyone who joined us. I see that there are some long-standing results advocates on the line who've been doing this work for years, if not decades, as well as some new faces who are doing this advocacy work with us for the first time. So welcome to all of you. And you know what Tom's going to talk about tonight is some of the outcomes of the research and the analysis and the conversations that have been happening. But also, you know, I think it's important before we even start to think about some of the applications of this work for us as advocates, recognizing that it's our job to convince people to move them to take action on the issues that we care about, whether that's working with the media or with the communities or with our members of Congress or other decision makers. And so constantly sort of thinking about how can we apply the learnings of this work to the advocacy work that we're doing every day, both in a broad sense in terms of bringing more people to understand and appreciate the importance of the issues that we work on, but also in a targeted way that when we know we're working with a specific member of Congress who represents us and we know where that person stands, what language can we use specifically tailored to that person and where they're starting to make sure that we're speaking most effectively. You know, we talk a lot at Results about the champion scale and identifying where our members of Congress are, where a member of the media is before we approach them. And that regardless of where someone is, whether they are entirely opposed to some of the programs that we support or fully in favor, there's always a step that we can move them up on that champion scale. And so identifying where people are and then finding creative ways to move them up that ladder is one of the really sort of valuable applications of this work, as well as, again, more broadly, figuring out how can we use this out in the public in our writing, in our work with editors, and with new members we might not know where they stand. And as you'll see in a second, in a lot of ways, this is not a radical shift. You're going to see things that you recognize and have heard before and perhaps are already using, but it's a really important shift, one that highlights some really key nuances in the way we talk about our issues, the way we highlight or sort of tone down different things in the sort of course of our rhetoric, and the way we layer our different messages together to be effective. So a couple of logistical notes before we get going. We'll start with a presentation from Tom, and then leave a good chunk of time for some question and answer and discussion among everyone on the phone here. As you've probably figured out, everyone on the line currently is muted, but when it comes time for the conversation, we can unmute people. So if you'd like to jump in with a question or if you have a reflection on some of the things that Tom's presenting, you can either type a note into the chat box and we will get those chats and we can try to moderate a bit of a discussion, or if you hit the button up on the right-hand corner of your screen, the little flag, and raise your flag, then we can actually unmute you so you can make a comment or ask a question. With that, I think I will turn it over to Tom so he can talk a little bit about the research. And then once he's finished and we've had some chance for some conversation, I'm going to then turn it over to my colleague, who many, if not all of you know, Ken Patterson, who's going to talk for a minute about some of the upcoming applications for this work over the next several months with results. So Tom, who's on the line with us, is a senior communications associate with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are great friends and supporters of results, for which we're very grateful. And Tom, thanks for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you. I just want to check that everyone can hear me okay. If people can't, and obviously send the chat things in and I can speak up. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the time to talk through this, and I hope to get through most of the presentation in fairly short order, certainly in no more than 30 minutes, and we can hopefully have a good, robust discussion later on. I'm going to talk in general terms about the problem that we were trying to solve with the project. I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we actually did, but I want to spend most of my time talking about sort of what we think the implications are for our work. I want to spend most of the time discussing actually, what we think we should do as a result of this. My job is to sort of conduct opinion research projects on behalf of the Gates Foundation. This was one of the most fun, I think, that we got to work on. It was, as Colin said, an extremely long process, but probably all the better for that. So I'm just going to go through a few slides now, and hopefully that will explain a bit about what we did, as well as getting to sort of what we learned. The first thing I want to start with is a brief overview of where the public are in terms of our issues. And I think for many of you, you will recognize a number of these themes here. We've done an awful lot of opinion research. As you can imagine, Gates Foundation enjoys data and enjoys analysis of such data. And for us, there are three, at a very general level, three key themes that tend to typify the way much of the general public thinks about development issues. The first is cynicism, and I've got a chart that will sort of explore this in a little more detail in a second. There is huge cynicism among the public audience. And we'll talk in a bit, I'm sure, about the differences between the different audiences, between the media, between Congress, between legislators, between the public. But this cynicism, I think, runs through an awful lot. It's rare to find people who understand the progress that's been made in the developing world. It's rare to find people who have those facts to hand. It's rare to find people who are willing to challenge the sort of received wisdom that things haven't really changed. There's also quite a significant distance between people in countries where there's money that comes through donations or particularly through foreign assistance, a significant amount of distance between the people in those countries and the people in the countries where we're doing most of our work. And I think that means there's a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding, and that creates its own problems. And then this final point, which I think is really crucial for us in this project, there is a sense among a lot of people, even particularly people who are actually quite positively inclined towards the principle of foreign assistance and certainly the principle of development work, that it's a waste of time, that it's futile, that their actions can't affect the outcome. And to me, if there's one thing we want to try and really push, really try and budge with our communications work, it's that. Because if you can convince people that their actions, their efforts can really make a real difference, then you really can have some sort of a demonstrable impact on their willingness to take part. So just to touch on one of those points with a small amount of data, these were three statements that we took and tested the extent to which people agreed or disagreed with these statements. And you can see them running there down the left-hand side of the slide. Top one, poor countries tend to stay poor. The second one, specific to billions in aid. And then the bottom one, that most of the countries that were poor 30 years ago are still poor today. To me, the numbers here are somewhat depressing. So 80% agreement with that bottom statement, more like 75 across the four countries with that second one. But it's the top one that really concerns me, which, again, has large majorities agreeing with it. Because the bottom two are thinking about the past. They're broadly retrospective, broadly thinking, oh, things have been bad. The top one is prospective. The top one is saying things will continue to be bad, and that there's something about being a poor country that means that country will remain poor. And I think that's more of a worry for us because, just because things have been bad doesn't mean they're going to be terrible in the future. But if people are thinking that these problems are unsolvable, that's something we really need to challenge. And I'm sure you will have experienced this in speaking with different people in your roles. So within all of that context, we had a fairly significant ambition for this project. We wanted to quite straightforwardly transform the way the sector talks about itself in order to reverse the decline of public support for our work and try to find a way to make all the work that all of us do more effective. You can see here the breadth of different partners who are involved in this work. Results obviously are one, but there are a number of different organizations who worked with us on this. And the principle was, if all of us as a group can be more effective, can be more clear, and I think also more coordinated, if we're able to speak, we all have different priorities, we all have different objectives, but if we're able to speak with somewhat approaching a consistent message, a consistent narrative, as we called it, then we're able to, we think, have more of an impact on public opinion and really try to get more people more supportive of the work that we're trying to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the audience that we covered, and I think this is where a lot of our discussion may go, because we were obviously talking with a public audience, and clearly they are similar to, but not the same as, some of the other audiences that you speak to. So I'd love to get your reactions to how you think some of the different audiences will receive these kind of arguments. But just to define the audience for a second, we spent a bit of time trying to figure out who we should talk to, and as a group, we sort of reconciled that it should be what we called the engaged public. Now, this is a relatively small portion of the audience. As you can see from this chart, you're talking about a third to maybe a quarter of the audience in each of these countries. US about 26%, and then the three other European countries more like a third. But these people qualify to be in that dark blue box at the top by having some level of knowledge about development issues, paying some attention to media coverage, and caring about these issues at least a bit. Like, there's at least some level to which these people care and pay attention to these issues. And that's important because it makes them quite different from everyone else. It makes them quite different from that grey group at the bottom there. And I think our logic was that we need to convince those people, the people in the dark blue box at the top, the engaged public, if we are ever to have a chance of convincing anyone else. So they're our sort of first target, and then after that, we absolutely want to move on and talk to everyone else, but we really need to be focused on them first. But we didn't really want to just end with that, because that's still quite a large portion of people. It's still in this country, tens of millions of people. So the goal was to try to split those out into three different sections. So within that dark blue box, you've got three different groups. You've got the skeptic group, which you can see in red here at the bottom of the screen. A fairly small proportion, people who are pretty cynical about development. It's worth noting, if we had taken this categorization and applied it to the whole public, that red box would be much, much larger. The majority of the public would fall into that box. But because we've isolated those people at the top who are engaged, they're actually quite a small proportion. You've then got this audience in this terrible purple color, which I still can't change, called the swings, and they're the people we want to focus on most of our efforts, and I'll come on to explain why in a second. And then you've got this blue group who are our supporters. And those people are, they're in fact, they're you. All the people who are on this call right now are supporters. They're people who are supportive, both in terms of the way that they would describe themselves, but also they tend to do things. They tend to take the kind of actions that are so important in demonstrating public support for these priorities. But it's that purple group that we really want to focus on because, as you can see, they're actually quite significant in size. If we can move those people, if we can shift those people up and turn them into pros, you were talking earlier, Colin, about a ladder that you guys have. This is a very similar concept, but we can shift people up and make them more supportive. Then we think we can grow the size of our audience and make them more effective and really demonstrate a broader public support. And there's a whole set of criteria you can see here for how different people tend to fall into each of these categories. These are general sort of typifying characteristics. They're clearly not true for everyone in the groups. And in the user guide themselves, which I gather has already been sent around and I'm happy to talk about in more detail, there's a lot more information on who these people are and sort of the different profiles of them, as well as more information about some of the research that we did. So that's the audience. I'm not going to show very much. I'll show a little bit of data at the end, but I'm not going to show very much data about the research projects for the benefit of time here. But I do want to spend a bit of time on what we took away from the research, on what we've called the insights from the work, but then what we think the implications are, because I think that gets us to more of the interesting discussion. The first thing, just on the inside, these are the 7 that we took away. And as I say, there's more detail in the user guide if you want it. But really, the first one we already knew. The first one was confirming a lot of what we already unfortunately knew from different research projects. But it was actually important, I think, to reevaluate and to confirm that. Public attitudes are negative entrenched, as I talked about at the beginning. But I think our goal with this research project was to really try and find out how entrenched they were. Can we move them? Could we shift people? And we found that we were able to, and I'll talk a little bit about what was able to shift people in a second. But that last point there about people having entrenched views is really crucial here, because the whole premise of this project is that we can change people's minds. And one of the things that I'm currently working on is how we sort of track people's attitudes over time and how we see are people actually changing their minds. But that's really crucial to what we were trying to get at with this project. The second one, which is swings, are a reachable audience. That's the point we were talking about before with the purple group, the people who, a significant audience, that if we can change their mind, we can significantly change the state of public opinion on these issues. The third one is really the central point to all of this. Self-reliance and independence were the most effective narratives that we tested. We tested a whole bunch of different kinds of frames, different kinds of arguments, and the ones that worked were self-reliance and independence. If any of you have ever done a focus group, or in fact, sure, in conversations that you've had, talked about these issues, I'm pretty sure that someone at some point will have said, we need to teach a man to fish, not give them a fish. This is that argument. This is that parable. And I've seen this in focus groups in all of the 4 countries where we've done here, but also in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, and wherever you go, there's some form of this parable, which is pretty consistent and very, very powerful. But it's not sufficient. And I'll come on to talk about how we need to back it up later on. But if there's kind of one thing that I tried to tell people about this project, it's that this is the most compelling argument we have. This fourth point was really an important thing for the Gates Foundation to learn. Progress, we talk a lot about progress. You'll have seen, I imagine, the Bill and Melinda Gates annual letter this year from earlier in last week, talking a lot about, what are the things that we think will happen in the next 15 years. We spend a lot of time telling people how childhood mortality has decreased significantly, trying to sort of push this story that things have improved. And what we found in this project, which is really quite sobering for us, was that it's not all that effective on its own. It's an important message and it needs to be part of the broader argument, but it cannot be the central point, because what we're doing when we make these arguments about progress, if there's nothing else there, all we're doing is telling people that they're wrong. All we're doing is going to them and saying, you are not right. You have the wrong impression about the developing world, and people are pretty resistant to that notion. So this was an important insight for us, and something we wanted to kind of take away and change the way we talk about the work as a result. The fifth one is hugely important. Gender equality as an issue was terrifically powerful with this audience. I mean, hugely resonant, an issue that we absolutely need to talk about more. And it's something that all audiences really found very compelling. So as a topic area, it's useful. Six is that point, as I was talking before, about futility. People need to believe that they can make a difference. I'm sure that's not a surprise to anyone. And then this point seven, we can successfully rebut attacks. I'm sure, again, many of you will have been on the receiving end of some critical arguments. And there is a bit of a debate within a lot of the organizations that we work with as to whether we should spend a lot of time trying to rebut those attacks or whether we should just simply ignore them. And our evidence from this project is pretty unequivocal. We should definitely try to rebut those attacks and respond to them with all the arguments that we can muster. So I want to talk now a bit about the sort of the implications of this. We think the first one and the most important one, as I said, is to always emphasize the goal of self-reliance. The language for this, it's interesting. It does differ from country to country. Self-reliance tended to work very well in the United States, whereas in the United Kingdom, self-sufficiency was actually a more effective articulation of that. But the basic principle is the same. This idea that the work that we're doing is to enable people to become self-sufficient. They have this independence to achieve things, this empowered sense, and that was really the way to get the most amount of support from people. And this idea of practical development support, a broader story of growing self-reliance around the world. Now, what you'll see there on the right side of the slide is the sort of corollary to that, which is don't state abstract goals like ending poverty as our ambition. This is causing a huge amount of challenge for all of us, because this entire year is where a lot of organizations are talking about ending extreme poverty. The challenge with that is that a lot of people simply don't believe it's possible. They talk about, a lot of the time in the groups, people would say, "Oh, I see poverty on my walk to work. I see poverty in my neighborhood. You can't end poverty." And because people have a fairly sort of a flexible version in their minds of what poverty means, and also, as we said at the beginning, quite a lot of distance between them and people in the developing world, they don't really understand what we mean when we say extreme poverty. So this is a real challenge for us, because we have to find ways to articulate and define what it is that we mean by extreme poverty. We appreciate we're not going to get a lot of organizations to stop saying it, because it's why they exist. But I think the key here is, how do we articulate that? How do we explain to people what we mean when we talk about ending extreme poverty? And that's quite important. Our next one, here we go. One of the things that I think we started with this project was a sort of analysis of how the sector currently communicates. That's a very important thing to do. We need to evaluate where we all are and what we're saying currently. And there has been, I don't think it's as true now, certainly, but there has been a lot of communication from the sector that has portrayed people in developing countries as voiceless, as sort of victims almost, as kind of passive recipients of development assistance. And what that has done for a lot of people is really embed this idea that people can't help themselves, that they are sort of helpless victims in this story. And that's terrifically damaging, because it means that there's no sense of progress, there's no sense of empowerment, there's no sense that people are able to solve problems for themselves, and it creates this dependency problem. And we see in some broader polling that we've done a lot of similarities between the way the public view people in developing countries and the way they view people on benefits or social security assistance. Now and welfare, that creates big problems for us in terms of the broader story that we're trying to tell. And as I said at the beginning, the sort of prospective story that we want to tell about how it is possible for these things to get better. It is possible for people to be able to lift themselves out of poverty. Now, there's a lot of debate about this point, particularly among organizations' fundraising departments, because their arguments are quite legitimately the best way to raise money is through urgency, is through pity, is through jeopardy, is through striking imagery that portrays the seriousness of these problems. And this is where this project is so much fun, because we get to have these kind of arguments and get to have these kind of experiments in the real world, which I'll come on to talk about in a second, to try to understand sort of how much is that true, how much can we still push the other thing, and also how much of a problem are we storing up for ourselves in the future if we continue to do those things. So this is a hotly contested one. I'd love to hear people's comments on it, but as a broad point, we found that we do need to portray people in a different way. Otherwise, we risk broader problems for ourselves in the future. This point sort of gets to a similar argument, which is that development tends to work through partnerships. The mental model for a lot of people when it comes to development is very problematic for us. The mental model that people describe is aid goes from my tax dollars to my government, and I don't particularly trust my government. They then transfer the money to another government who I definitely don't trust, and then that money gets wasted through corruption often, but also just through inefficiencies. And we need to break that model. I mean, we need to disassociate people's minds from the way that they think development works. And a lot of that is about partnership. It's about there's interest on both sides. There's a whole bunch of different actors involved. There's reciprocal benefits to us as well as benefits to the people in the developing world. And there's a whole bunch of other areas there, but trying to disrupt, as people like to say, that model in people's minds as to how development works, I think is an important part of this. And this is more about the stories we tell than about specific facts. And this one really is as much for the Gates Foundation as anyone else. We should use progress as a tool and not just as a story in itself, that we need to find more compelling ways to tell that story. So I'm going to talk a bit about the narrative now and then hopefully get to questions fairly swiftly. This is just a visual representation, and I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of it in a second. For us, the most important thing that you can focus on is this independence argument. There's this point then about shared values and about how people, this is all that point about how we portray people and how we talk about the work that we do. And then partnership, we've got obviously we were just talking about trying to disrupt the way people think about these issues. Now, what the point of this project, of course, was that all of the different organizations we work with could also talk about the things they care about. Because, we work with the One Campaign, for example, who are a very politically focused organization. But then there are also in Germany, we work with Welthungerhilfe, who are entirely focused on nutrition and agriculture issues. Now, both of those organizations need to be able to use this narrative. So what you see when you see the support theme under there is really our attempt to say, you should still be able to talk about the thing you want to talk about. For us, we still want to talk about progress. We still want to talk about women and girls and gender equality, and really trying to allow people the freedom to talk about their issue, but within the context and within the framework of this broader narrative is the goal here. And that's really a balancing act that we just have to spend our time trying to resolve. And this is where it's important, I think, for forums like this, for people to say, well, this is how I can see it working for me. This is how I can see it posing challenges. And I don't really think this works for us. And that's really the value of all of this, I think. There's a little bit more detail here about each of the narrative messages within that. And obviously, all of this is in the user guide more generally. I want to give a couple of examples because I think it's always more useful than just talking about the research. This one is something we did with the UN Foundation. They were running their Shot at Life campaign. And so they said, okay, well, what if we took what we were going to say as part of the campaign and sort of put it through a narrative project, rinse, as we called it, to sort of see how things would have been different. And you can see in there bringing the themes of independence in more. I particularly like the one at the bottom, bringing in the theme of partnership. Really listing out all the different actors involved and trying to disrupt that model that it's just the government doing something. There's a lot of people involved here, and everyone's got a role to play. I think this is very effective. And then we've also got some things we don't want to do. So all the fact and figures point. We've talked a bit about the pity point. The long-term timeframes. I mean, this is particularly again challenging at the moment, where this year is obviously the replacement of the MDGs with the SDGs, and we're all going to be talking in 15-year time horizons, which are very difficult for people to sort of grapple with, and actually are quite difficult for politicians to grapple with when they're thinking in terms of electoral cycles that are much shorter than a 15-year time horizon. There's also, beyond the term foreign aid itself, which of course covers so much of this area, is a really problematic phrase. I mean, it's two terrible words for us to use. Foreign, creating that distance again that I mentioned, and aid, which builds this dependency model in people's mind that we want to try and get away from. And then the corruption point that I'm sure you've all come across before. Try not to downplay that, actually trying to confront that head on. I want to leave those a second and talk a little about a real world test, because I love talking about the research, but of course it's not actually real. It's a survey. So this is an actual test that we did. We took a bunch of content that we had created ourselves, Save the Children, UNF, and One, and did what UNF had done and put it through a change process to make it work with the Narrative Project findings. We then shared it on Facebook and Twitter on the usual channels, and compared how it performed to content that we run over the previous 3 months. So the previous 3 months was kind of our benchmark, how did we do? And then we put the Narrative Project stuff in and tried to see if it had done any better. And we did this at the end of last year. And the good news, at least for me, was that we saw an increase in all the things that you want to see, with the exception of one organization. For 3 of the 4, we saw an improvement in engagement rates, which is all the things you want on social media. The retweets, the likes, the comments, the shares, all weighted to make sure that we were looking at the right kind of figures. And beyond the Narrative Project doing better, we also found that the women and girls stuff, the areas where we focused on gender equality instead of more broad development issues, really did fantastically as well. But at least within a setting online where people are engaging with these topics, the Narrative Project worked. It was more compelling to our audience. Now, there are a number of different ways we can track this. We're doing some work with different organizations around their fundraising. We're doing others around little campaigns that people are running, political campaigns, petitions, that kind of thing, to see whether this is actually making a difference, because we think it's good and we think it's going to be able to help us, but we need to see it work in the real world. And I think that's really where, again, I'd like to hear from your thoughts as to how this can be applied. So that sort of gets through the 25 slides that we've got. I've listed out some discussion points here, and when I've shared this with other people in the past, this has been somewhat useful. But I would love to hear questions, if there are, about the methodology, about why we did what we did. But I think 2 really tend to stand out to me as relevant, particularly to this group. The first one is audience. Obviously, this is covering the US, the UK, France, and Germany. I'm very happy to talk about US findings in particular and what was different there, and what could be more interesting, and also then how we think this kind of argument relates to people in legislative positions, or people in the media, or people within the sector, or other audiences where we've done other research, and I can talk about that. And then the second one is what seems relevant and what seems impossible in terms of your work. Is there anything in here that you just don't see how you can use it, or it seems incompatible with the way that you've talked about this kind of work before? Because I think for us, we're still trying to figure out how flexible this is, because the balance, of course, is between trying to get alignment and trying to get coordination, and then also trying to give people the flexibility to talk about what they want to talk about, because fundamentally everyone still has their own issues, still has their own priorities, and still wants to pursue their topics. So those are the questions I'm interested in, but I'm more than happy to open it up, and Colin, happy to let you run that and to answer them in whatever way seems most appropriate.
Great. Yeah. And just thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciate it. To remind everyone, you can either type questions into the group chat window, which has the two little gray uh, cartoon speech bubbles, or if you hit the flag button in the upper right hand corner of your screen, that'll send a little note and then we can unmute your microphone. Tom, thanks so much. And I think a lot of lessons for all of us, both seeing some things that are familiar that perhaps we're doing well, and then also some real areas for adjustment. So thank you. Two questions that I've seen already. Several people actually in advance were asking, how do you use some of this research and information to address the issue of we have huge poverty problems here at home? And also recognizing that Results is an organization that also works on those issues. And then the second question here that I just had in front of me and now has disappeared. So I apologize that I can't see who asked it right at the moment. But it was, what is the role of personal stories in the narrative? And the question now I'm seeing it here is from Patty Huffland. Should we try to tell stories that are more relatable to the everyday person versus sort of the difference between shock value and relatable stories, and bringing things home for people personally versus presenting reality perhaps in a less relatable but more dramatic way?
Yeah. So let me talk about the personal stories thing first, because I think it's really interesting. We've done within this project, we didn't do much on sort of messenger, like who tells a story, but we've done it in other projects, and I think it's really telling. The there are two different sort of schools of thought on this. One is that the most effective way to convince someone is to give them knowledge, and is to help them sort of understand these problems more. And I think that's undoubtedly true. You definitely need people to understand these issues more to see to see help them understand the problems and to help them understand what they can do. But the second school of thought is that you need to connect people emotionally to the subject. And to me, at least in the evidence that I've seen, that is more powerful than simple knowledge and simple information. And one of the best ways to connect people to these stories emotionally is by telling a personal variation of it. You absolutely need the statistics. You need to convince people of the scale of the problem. You also need to convince people of the scale of the progress that's been made. And numbers are important. They always need to certainly be there, but they need to be in the background, because the first thing, the thing that people will connect with, the thing that will get people emotionally invested, and to me, most importantly, the thing that people will remember are personal stories. People don't tend to have very, very good at remembering facts. Big statistics are just they're hard to store unless you've got mnemonics or something to kind of give you a way to remember them. They're actually quite difficult for people to recall, particularly about an issue with which they're not all that familiar. But a story is much easier. And one of the things that we found, at least in some of the recall experiments that we've done, is people, when they've got a personal story to identify something with, much better to recall the information later on. So for us, the evidence is pretty clear. With public audience, you do need the personal stories, and that should be the thing that you actually lead with. And it should then be supported by all the facts and information and the kind of macro story that you want to tell. The poverty at home thing is really crucial. It's in focus groups. Again, it comes up so very quickly, and the challenge we have is that certainly in the last few years we've seen more people saying that poverty at home is in opposition to poverty abroad. That the two, we need to prioritize the poverty. Charity begins at home, and we need to prioritize people who are poor in this country. And there's this a lot of arguments around we borrow money from other countries only to then give it away, and all of this kind of stuff. The hard part about that argument is that there's not really a strong way to rebut it. What I can say is that people who care about domestic poverty also tend to care about poverty in the developing world. The two audiences are quite similar. What we need to do is explain, first of all, that it's not a zero sum game, that it's not like we're taking money from poor people in America and giving it to poor people in poor countries. That's not how it works. If you can generate a sense of common humanity, a sense of this is a worthwhile thing to pursue, then prioritizing domestic poverty, absolutely, but that has to go hand in hand with prioritizing poverty elsewhere. And this sense of, a common humanity is very powerful in that. But I do think it's a real challenge. What we found, at least through survey research, is that the people who throw this argument back are actually the least likely to care about either. That it's actually a sort of an easy way for people who are not really that concerned about either issue to simply dodge the question. Now that's not always true, and there are certainly plenty of people who have a different view. But at a general level, there are lots of people who simply use it as an excuse to avoid the tough question. So I think the way to respond is to simply say that the two are not exclusive; they're actually complementary. And if we are focused on the world's poor, that means at home and it means abroad as well. And that there are plenty of other things that are less of a priority that we could, if it comes to government budgets, that we could defund ahead of those priorities in order to maintain the small amounts that we spend on these things right now, or indeed increase them. But it is a challenging argument, and it is one that I think is more common now than it was, say, 5, 6, 10 years ago.
Great, thank you. Jumping to the next set of questions here, I'll fire three at you this time. One question, which is there a way to talk about foreign aid, or is it helpful to talk about the ways in which this work is in everyone's best interests, or sort of how the self-interest argument works? Two, a question from Debbie in Salt Lake City. So we're trying to avoid the words foreign aid. What's a better term? And a question from Nancy in Connecticut. And I, in my role, am particularly interested to hear your answer on this one as well, which is that Results' tagline is the power to end poverty. Is there a way we can be describing our goal as an organization in a different way?
Yeah. So let me talk about the last one, because I think it's crucial. The challenge we have is that people don't think we can end poverty. When you talk to people about it, the definition of what poverty is just enormous. I mean, it covers so many things. There are lots and lots of people who they won't define themselves as poor, but they will define people very close to them and people with direct relationships that they have with them as poor. And so that means that their views of what would be required in order to end poverty are colossal, and therefore unimaginably large and impossible to achieve. I think that once you're able to explain what you mean by poverty, once you're able to explain to define the term, then it's completely fine. But I do think there's a challenge there to say to sort of articulate it in a way that's believable. Now, the counterpoint to that, and this is an argument we've had a few times with different organisations who use this message already, is that it's incredibly aspirational, right? It should seem large. It should seem very difficult to achieve, and I think that's certainly true for a certain audience. It's true for what I would argue are already our supporters. So the people who are already with us, yeah, ending poverty, ending extreme poverty, they're bought into that. They think it's worth pursuing. But that swing group, that group that we're trying to kind of expand, not expand, that group that we're trying to reach and to convert into supporters, they're more skeptical. And I think that the trick for us is, I think that the line that you have is terrifically powerful for people who are already with us. But in order to try to reach new people and to convince new people to become involved, I suspect that they'll view it with some cynicism. So one of the things that we're trying to figure out with all of the partners at the moment is how adaptable can we be with different audiences. If we're going to people we know, then certainly we don't necessarily want to change too much of that, because we know that that's one of the reasons that they're with us, and it's one of the reasons that they want to help. But if we're going to new people, if we're trying to reach new audiences, young people, people who are not necessarily already part of these issues, people who maybe know a little less, they may need something different. So I think that would be my recommendation on that point more generally. To give them something that they can see as more achievable is probably an easier way to get them in. And then once they're in, you can explain what poverty means, and you can go into more detail, and it's easier to talk about those issues. What's better than foreign aid is a great question. Foreign assistance is marginally better, but not much. Um, what's actually better, and this isn't a very satisfactory answer, is to not talk about it at all. Um, the best way is to talk about specific programs. The best way is to so Gavi. We just had the replenishment this week. Terrifically successful vaccines initiative for kids in the developing world to get access to vaccines and medical treatments that otherwise they wouldn't, by bringing the price down. Hugely successful thing. It's great to talk about something like that specifically. PEPFAR is a brilliant example. People who are incredibly cynical about foreign aid generally love PEPFAR. I think it's a fantastic program, because it's focused on a disease that people know and have some experience of with HIV/AIDS. It's also got a lot of credibility with specific audiences who are generally more cynical about us because it was an initiative from a Republican president. There's a lot of single initiatives that can have some huge breakthroughs there. But talking about government spending on aid in general terms is rarely effective, because some of the language that we have for it just isn't very good. And the thing is, we could change the language, but fundamentally we'd still be talking about a transfer of tax money, which people are not particularly positive about. So it's not a very sort of helpful response, I suppose. We try to talk about programs to help the world's poorest people, um, health programs, agriculture programs, trying to get a bit more specific and to get outside of the sort of the aid framework. But we tested a number of different phrases, and anytime you try to define the concept, it's just it's almost not a matter of language at that point. It's a matter of the concept, which makes it very difficult to talk about. The self-interest arguments are really there's a lot of difference by audience there. Generally speaking, they don't work with the public, particularly the national security ones. The argument that we will reduce the likelihood of terrorist attacks at home if we invest in this stuff with a public audience don't seem to resonate, and we think that has more to do with the fact that the public don't really think these programs work, rather than about any disagreement with the idea of pursuing self-interest as being a good thing. I think people would agree that aid should be reciprocal. It should have benefits for people abroad, and it should also have benefits at home. The challenge is they don't think that it works. So you face that kind of impasse immediately. However, with a more elite audience, and particularly a more elite conservative audience, it's actually very effective. Talking about self-interest, particularly the economic self-interest, the idea of trading partners, the idea of growing markets abroad for goods that are produced here in the US. Those arguments tend to work with that audience in a specific way. But with a public audience, again, even the economic arguments are they're okay, but they don't seem to work as well as some of the other things that we talked about earlier. So it's almost it's a challenge for us, because I think if we could find a compelling way to talk about it, if we could convince people that development was effective, I think the self-interest arguments will be really powerful for us. But at the moment, we face a sort of a prior problem, which is that people don't believe that it works. So we need to solve that before we can start making arguments about self-interest.
Great, thanks. And let's take time. I'm going to wrap two more questions into one, or I'm going to attempt to. I'll just tell you what they both are. We'll see if we can wrap the answers together. One from Shirley Jane in South Dakota, who's pointing out that in her rural South Dakota community, she feels like the number of supporters is a much lower percentage of the population, and that there are likely some swing people out there, but how do we find them? And a question from Kathleen in Las Vegas, pointing out that a lot of new members of the House and the Senate come from the Tea Party, and how can we sort of specifically target them to be effective and positive in our speaking?
Hmm. So the last one is very difficult. The last one is super hard. I mean, particularly because a lot of the things that we're talking about here are government initiatives, or at least supported by government initiatives. And I think it's just an impossible argument with people who don't believe that the government should be involved in a significant way in this kind of work. Where you can, and this is the great value of the independence and self-sufficiency argument. Where you can have a conversation is outside of government money, the stuff that say the stuff that results are doing, or the stuff that another partner are doing, where people are investing their own time and their own efforts and their own resources in trying to help address these problems. That is an argument that people on the right of the political spectrum will value and will appreciate and will listen to. In the user guide that's been sent around, there's a bit more information in there about how if you've got a more skeptical audience, you can dial some things up and drop some things down. And this is one of those points where I think you can definitely talk about independence and self-sufficiency with that audience. You just can't talk about large government funding because it's just not something they believe in. So I think it's more about some of those conceptual points and less about the government money in those instances. When it comes to how to find swings, this is great stuff for someone like me because I used to work in political polling and research, and this is the holy grail, right? This is how do you find people who are convertible. There's a few things again in the user guide about what these people look like and the kinds of media that they consume and some demographic information. But broadly speaking, they tend to be fairly centrist. They are much more likely to be independents than the other two groups. They're much more likely to be interested in the world. So, paying attention to world news or have a significant interest in travel or, generally speaking, somewhat interested in other countries. And that doesn't necessarily need to be the developing world. It can be other countries in the developed world. It can be it can be China. It can be Russia. It can be South America. It can be Africa. It can be any part of the world. But they have a global mindset. That's a way for people to sort of be identified as swings. And I think the other thing, and it sounds somewhat tautological, but they are undecided. I mean, they don't have a set views on these issues. So you can usually tell. I think when you talk to people about this stuff, if they've already made up their mind. If they haven't, then they're a swing, and they're an appropriate person to talk to about these stuff. But I agree. I mean, one of the things we have found is it varies enormously where you live, demographic information about age and education level and income and all those other kind of things that really do affect the likelihood of people falling into one of those different categories. But I would say look for the people who are centrist politically, who are interested in the world around them, and who haven't made up their minds at the moment about a lot of these issues.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. I really, really appreciate your time. And I do encourage everyone. I know I missed a few questions in the chat, and there were some really great comments about the value of this and application to Gavi replenishment yesterday and all of that. And so I want to take a moment in sort of thinking about the application piece to turn things over to Ken Patterson, because this wouldn't be a results event if we didn't ask you to then go home and do something with the information we've discussed tonight. But one additional note for everyone: Tom referenced the user guide several times. I think some of you already have that, and we will recirculate it to everyone who participated, as well as really the whole results family. It's a tremendous document. It's There's a lot in there. Take your time with it. I have a copy on my desk. There are lists of do's and don'ts, and those dials Tom was mentioning are actually incredibly helpful, and easy to digest. So keep an eye out for that in your email. And a big thanks to Tom, and I'll turn it over to you, Ken.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom, for being on with us tonight. I'm getting lots of comments about how helpful all of this is. This is something that we deal with at the core of what we do so often. And just, I mean, a couple of thoughts for the folks out there about ways or places to use this. I'm sure there are already things going through your head about, like, what can I do with this? We've got appropriation season coming up right now, and we've talked about foreign assistance and all those sorts of things. Our appropriations messaging, both for our elected officials and all for people we're putting into action around appropriations, seems like a great place to be using a lot of this messaging. The reasons we request face-to-face meetings, sometimes we get those requests from schedulers, using this as we speak to the schedulers and our aides in those offices. Another thing that I think was sort of kind of borne out in our Gavi campaign was, as we've been working on the Gavi campaign, we've been encouraging people to say, join us for this project. It's really tough when you tell people, join us for the ending of poverty. And it's like, oh my God, I'm in this forever. But if you say, we've got big ambitions in the world, but join us for this project. Our goal is to do X, Y, and Z, and you can be a part of that. Right now, you have an opportunity to go back to those people and say, here, this is what happened with our project. Join us for the next project. We're working on maternal and child health in the coming year and going to make some real strides on that. Or global education, really working on ramping up the number of kids that actually get a chance to go to school. We know what that does for people's opportunity. We know what that does for people, for countries' economies, and for self-sufficiency. And so we're really working those words into things. So we know what we're working for long term, and a lot of people sign up for results for that. But for people you're bringing in anew, some of this sort of like join us for the project may be a way to do it. Listening to what Tom had to say there. Messaging for folks in outreach meetings. So again, this is where that might come into play as well, as you're talking to people about the Nicholas Kristof event that we're going to be doing, and talking about our programs afterwards, or what we're working on afterwards. And then you've got a number of you've gotten a list of names from our Care to Purchase for people in your community. So as you word emails to them, also using some of this information about helping people work towards self-sufficiency and some of these other things that you learned tonight could be really helpful in messaging to those people. And then there was one great comment from Misty Novich about that this stuff you're not gonna absorb this from one evening on the webinar with Tom, as good as he is. And but you do have the resources to go through this again, use it and practice it. And Misty Novich was saying that we should be really working some role plays into what we're doing and talking to each other on this as well. And I think that's a fantastic idea. And Tom, if you had ideas for exercises that we could be running for ourselves, and actually practicing this stuff, that would be great. It's something that Results does. I mean, we practice and we role play with each other and we do those kinds of things. So ideas for that would be really helpful. I think that's all I've got for tips and thoughts right now, Colin.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much, everybody. We're actually going to end close to on time, so how about that? And you all know how to be in touch with me and with Ken if you have any questions or follow up. And as I mentioned, we will absolutely recirculate or circulate the user guide, and happy to recirculate slides from this evening, as well as a recording for anyone who might find that helpful. So thank you again, Tom, for not only joining us tonight, but for helping lead this fantastic work. I know those of us who have been involved for a while are really grateful for the leadership from you and from the foundation, and really excited to be getting to use some of this now in real life. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for being on the line, and we hope you all have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody.